Welcome to History Before Bed, where we bring you calming tales from the past, crafted to gently guide you to sleep. Tonight, we'll take a journey to late 18th century France and beyond, exploring a world where everyday lives cross paths with extraordinary moments in history. In this story, some characters spring from imagination, while others, like Napoleon Bonaparte, are real figures, drawn straight from the pages of history. Every detail about these historical figures is grounded in fact, while the fictional elements help paint a fuller, richer picture of what life might have been like in their time. So, take a deep breath, settle in, and let this blend of history and storytelling ease your mind. Together, we'll drift into a world of soft echoes from the past. Sweet dreams and good night. Chapter 1. The streets of Ajaccio. The afternoon sun hung lazily over the whitewashed buildings of Ajaccio, casting long shadows that danced across the cobblestone streets. The salty tang of the Mediterranean breeze wound its way through the narrow alleys, mingling with the earthy aroma of bread baking in clay ovens. Chickens clucked from small yards hemmed by crumbling stone walls, and the occasional bark of a dog echoed faintly against the surrounding hills. In the heart of this modest Corsican town, a boy no more than 9 years old stood apart from the daily bustle. His clothes, though neat, bore the wear of a family striving to maintain their pride amid modest means. Napoleon Bonaparte, with a mane of dark hair that refused to lie flat, gazed intently at the harbor below. His dark, piercing eyes that would one day command armies, were now fixed on the French ships at anchor. Their pristine sails and polished brass fittings seemed out of place amidst the rugged simplicity of Corsica. Napoleon turned his gaze inland, where the thickly forested hills of his homeland rose, their jagged peaks crowned with stubborn clouds. The boy had always felt a peculiar bond with this land, its beauty intertwined with a painful history of subjugation. His father, Carlo, often spoke of Corsica's struggles for independence, recounting tales of Pasquale Paoli, the revolutionary leader who fought to free the island from Genoese and French rule. Napoleon's young mind absorbed these stories like a sponge, his heart swelling with pride and anger in equal measure. But Carlo also spoke of France, of its elegance, its power, and its opportunity. For Napoleon, these ideas were not contradictory but fuel for a deeper ambition. He wanted to escape Ajaccio, not because he scorned it, but because he believed he was meant for something greater. Corsica was his foundation, but it could not be his destiny. On this day, Napoleon wandered toward the Place Foch, where French soldiers in crisp uniforms stood at attention. Their movements, precise and mechanical, contrasted sharply with the loose, languid strides of the Corsican peasants passing by. Napoleon lingered, his sharp ears picking up snippets of conversation, harsh orders in French and the softer lilt of Corsican voices speaking of crops, trade, and family. Among the crowd, his mother, Letizia, stood tall despite her petite frame, speaking with a vendor. She cast an occasional glance toward her son, her expression both proud and wary. Letizia knew Napoleon was no ordinary boy. His fiery temperament and relentless curiosity often set him apart from his peers. She had overheard him practicing French phrases late into the night, his small voice breaking the silence of their modest home as he repeated foreign words with determined precision. Napoleon's thoughts were interrupted by the approach of his father, a man whose polished demeanor and refined speech often set him apart in Ajaccio. Carlo carried news today, a letter from France, sealed with an official insignia. As Carlo unfolded the parchment, his face bore a mix of pride and hesitation. "Napoleon," he said, his Corsican accent softening the French name, "you have been granted a scholarship to the Royal Military Academy in Brienne." The boy's heart leapt. He knew what this meant, even if the full weight of the opportunity had not yet sunk in. It was a chance to escape the confines of Ajaccio, to step onto the mainland and into a world where he could prove himself. Yet as the reality of leaving his family in Corsica began to dawn, a flicker of unease crossed his face. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Napoleon climbed a rugged hill outside the town. He sat alone, his small frame silhouetted against the glowing expanse of the Mediterranean. Below him, the lights of Ajaccio twinkled, and beyond, the French ships bobbed gently on the waves. In the stillness, he felt the weight of his choice. Corsica was his home, but his future lay elsewhere. One day he vowed silently he would return, not as a boy seeking his place, but as a man who had claimed it. Napoleon rose and dusted off his trousers. The wind carried the faintest echo of the waves crashing below, a rhythm as constant and unyielding as his own resolve. The path to greatness was before him, and though it was fraught with challenges, he was ready to take the first step. Chapter 2: The Siege of Toulon. The acrid stench of gunpowder hung heavy in the air, mingling with the coppery tang of blood and sweat. Smoke rose in billowing plumes from the battlefield, casting a gray pall over the once scenic port of Toulon. The Mediterranean shimmered faintly in the distance, a serene contrast to the chaos of war unfolding along its shores. The cries of wounded soldiers and the relentless thunder of cannon fire echoed across the embattled landscape, a grim symphony of revolution. At the heart of the action, Napoleon Bonaparte stood atop a makeshift rampart, his slight frame silhouetted against the smoldering horizon. Dressed in the blue and red uniform of a French artillery officer, he barked orders with a voice that carried above the cacophony. His dark eyes burned with intensity as he gestured toward a cluster of enemy positions on the heights. "Concentrate fire there! We must dislodge their guns or this position is lost," he commanded, his tone as sharp and unyielding as the cold iron of the cannons he directed. It had been weeks since Napoleon arrived at Toulon, a city seized by royalist forces with the backing of the British Navy. The young officer, just 24, had been tasked with organizing the artillery for the Revolutionary Army. Toulon's capture was vital for the Republic's survival, and Napoleon knew the stakes could not be higher. The siege had dragged on, bogged down by indecision and poorly coordinated attacks. But from the moment he arrived, Napoleon had seen the solution. His plan was audacious, bordering on reckless. A concentrated artillery barrage aimed at crippling the Royalist and British defenses around Fort Mulgrave, a key stronghold guarding the harbor. It would require precision, coordination, and nerves of steel, but if successful, it could turn the tide of the battle. Napoleon had spent days tirelessly positioning his cannons, supervising their placement with meticulous care. He had personally calculated the trajectories, barking corrections and sparing no patience for incompetence. His men, though initially skeptical of their young commander, could not help but admire his unrelenting energy and confidence. Now, as the cannons roared to life, their iron barrels belching flame and death, Napoleon watched with grim satisfaction. The enemy's defensive lines trembled under the sustained assault. Earth and timber exploded into the air as round after round slammed into the fortifications. Behind him, a courier galloped up, his horse lathered with sweat. "Captain Bonaparte," the man began breathlessly, "General de Gaumier wants to know if the assault can proceed." Napoleon turned, his face flushed with exertion but alight with determination. "Tell the general the way is clear. We strike now, or we may as well give Toulon to the British for good." The courier hesitated, momentarily taken aback by the forcefulness of the reply. Before saluting and spurring his horse back toward headquarters, Napoleon turned back to his men. "Prepare for the charge. Once the fort is ours, the city falls." The assault that followed was brutal. Republican forces surged forward under a hail of enemy fire, scaling the shattered defenses of Fort Mulgrave with bayonets fixed. Napoleon himself remained at the artillery lines, directing fire to suppress enemy reinforcements. His composure under fire inspired those around him, and despite heavy casualties, the fort fell by nightfall. The victory at Toulon was decisive. With the harbor in Republican hands, British fleet was forced to retreat, leaving the royalist defenders to surrender or flee. The Revolutionary Army marched into the city amidst the cheers of its citizens, many of whom had suffered under royalist rule. For Napoleon, the victory was more than a triumph. It was a vindication. Word of his role in the siege quickly spread, reaching the ears of the revolutionary government in Paris. In the days that followed, he was promoted to brigadier general, an extraordinary achievement for someone so young. As he stood on the battlements overlooking the harbor, now silent but for the gentle lapping of waves, Napoleon allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. The battle had been a baptism of fire, and he had emerged not just unscathed, but triumphant. The echoes of his cannon fire had announced his arrival on the stage of history. Yet, even in this moment of triumph, his thoughts turned to the future. Toulon was only the beginning. The Republic was in turmoil, and opportunities for advancement were as plentiful as the dangers. Napoleon gripped the hilt of his sword, his knuckles whitening. Destiny had called him here, and he had answered. He would answer again, as many times as it took to carve his name into the annals of history. Chapter 3: Rising Star in Revolutionary France, 1795 to 1796. The streets of Paris teemed with restless energy, the air heavy with the scent of damp cobblestones and the acrid smoke of extinguished torches. Revolutionary fervor still gripped the city, though the initial euphoria of liberty, equality, and fraternity had given way to fear and suspicion. Political factions clashed in the chambers of government, while on the streets, discontent brewed among royalists and radicals alike. It was a city poised on a knife's edge, where fortunes could be made or ruined in an instant. Napoleon Bonaparte strode through the chaos with a purpose that belied his modest stature. His uniform, though well kept, bore the signs of wear, a testament to his years in the field. At 26, he was still an unfamiliar figure to most Parisians, but that would soon change. His moment had arrived in October 1795, when a royalist uprising threatened the fragile stability of the revolutionary government. The scene outside the Tuileries Palace had been one of pandemonium. Armed mobs of royalists surged through the streets, their numbers swelling with each passing hour. The government, desperate to maintain control, called upon its loyal officers to defend the city. It was Napoleon who stepped forward with a plan that would cement his reputation. The artillery, he had declared, would decide the day. Napoleon directed his men to position cannons strategically along key thoroughfares, their barrels loaded with grape shot, a deadly mixture of small iron balls that could cut through masses of men like a scythe through wheat. As the mob approached, he gave the order. The cannons roared to life, unleashing a storm of shrapnel that scattered the royalists in moments. The decisive action, later immortalized as the whiff of grape shot, saved the government and propelled Napoleon into the public eye. In the aftermath, Paris buzzed with talk of the audacious young officer who had quelled the uprising. Napoleon's name began to circulate in salons and cafes, his star rising as swiftly as the cannons he commanded. Among those who heard of his exploits was a woman whose charm and connections would soon intertwine with his destiny. Josephine de Beauharnais, a widow of aristocratic birth, moved through the circles of Parisian society with a grace that belied the turbulence of her past. She had survived the guillotine during the Reign of Terror, emerging from the ordeal with her allure intact and a web of influential acquaintances. When she and Napoleon met at a soirée, she saw in him a man of ambition and promise. He, in turn, was captivated by her poise and sophistication, qualities that seemed worlds apart from his own Corsican upbringing. Their courtship was anything but conventional. Josephine, older and more experienced, often seemed indifferent to Napoleon's ardent declarations of love. Yet he pursued her with relentless determination, writing her passionate letters that spoke of a longing he could scarcely contain. Josephine, though not immune to his intensity, was pragmatic. She saw in Napoleon a man on the ascent, a partner who could secure her future in an uncertain world. Their union, formalized in a modest ceremony in March 1796, was as much a partnership of convenience as it was of affection. Josephine's connections opened doors for Napoleon, introducing him to figures who could advance his career. It was not long after their marriage that he received command of the French Army of Italy, a posting that would become the proving ground for his military genius. Before departing for the front, Napoleon spent one last evening with Josephine in their modest Parisian apartment. The flicker of candlelight played across the room, casting shadows that seemed to dance with the unease in his heart. He studied her face, memorizing its every contour as though unsure when he might see her again. Josephine, for her part, was poised as always, though she seemed to sense the weight of the moment. "You will write to me," he said, his voice soft but insistent. "Of course," she replied with a faint smile, though her eyes betrayed a trace of doubt. Napoleon kissed her hand, lingering as though reluctant to let her go. Then, with a final glance, he turned and stepped into the night. The journey to Italy was marked by long hours of planning and reflection. Napoleon pored over maps of the rugged terrain, his mind racing with strategies for an army that was poorly equipped and demoralized. Yet he saw opportunity where others saw despair. Italy, he believed, would be the stage where he could prove not just his military skill, but his destiny. As his carriage rumbled southward, Napoleon allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The whiff of grape shot had opened the door, and Josephine had helped him step through it. Now the future stretched before him like an uncharted battlefield, ripe for conquest. Chapter 4: The Italian Campaign. The rugged mountains of northern Italy loomed ahead, their jagged peaks wreathed in mist, as the French army of Italy marched forward with a dogged determination that belied their ragged appearance. Their uniforms were threadbare, their boots worn to the soles, and hunger gnawed at their bellies. Yet, when Napoleon Bonaparte addressed his troops, his words carried an electric charge, igniting their spirits despite the grim reality of their condition. "Soldiers," he had proclaimed upon taking command, his voice clear and unyielding, "you are poorly fed and almost naked. The government owes you much, but it can give you nothing. I will lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. There you will find honor, glory, and wealth." It was a promise as bold as the man who made it, and his army responded with cheers that echoed across the Alpine passes. They followed him, not because of the scarcity of alternatives, but because Napoleon possessed an uncanny ability to inspire loyalty. He made them believe in the impossible, and in Italy, he would prove that the impossible was within their grasp. The campaign began with audacity. Napoleon's forces faced the Austrian army and their Piedmontese allies, both better supplied and more numerous. But where his enemies saw insurmountable obstacles, Napoleon saw opportunities. He moved with startling speed, striking at weak points and dividing his foes. At Mononata, his forces achieved their first victory, and from there the momentum became unstoppable. In a series of rapid engagements, Millesimo, Dago, and Mondovi, Napoleon's troops outmaneuvered their adversaries, forcing the Kingdom of Sardinia to sue for peace. The Austrians, stunned by the unorthodox tactics of this upstart general, regrouped but found themselves outflanked at every turn. Napoleon's genius lay in his ability to anticipate the movements of his enemies, using the terrain to his advantage and delivering decisive blows where they least expected. The Battle of Lodi in May 1796 marked a turning point. As Austrian forces retreated across the Adda River, they sought to make a stand at the bridge near the town of Lodi. Napoleon, refusing to let them escape, ordered a frontal assault that many considered reckless. The French artillery pounded the Austrian defenses, and when the moment came, Napoleon himself led the charge across the bridge, his figure cutting through the smoke like a phantom. His troops followed with a roar, driving the Austrians into disarray and securing a resounding victory. The Little Corporal, as his soldiers affectionately called him, became a legend that day. Stories of his bravery spread like wildfire, and his men began to see him as more than a mere commander. He was their leader, their inspiration, a man destined for greatness. With northern Italy under French control, Napoleon turned his attention southward. Cities fell one after another as his forces swept through the Po Valley. At each stop, Napoleon's keen political instincts came to the fore. He negotiated treaties that brought much-needed supplies and wealth to his army, while extracting heavy tributes from the defeated. The French flag rose over Milan, and treasures from churches and palaces were shipped back to Paris, enriching the Republic and bolstering Napoleon's reputation. Yet the campaign was not without its challenges. The Austrian army, reinforced and emboldened, launched counterattacks that tested Napoleon's resolve. At Arcole, the fighting was fierce, with French and Austrian soldiers locked in brutal combat amid the marshes and narrow bridges. Napoleon, ever the master of morale, seized a flag and charged forward himself, rallying his troops to an improbable victory. His men would later recall how he seemed invincible, a man who thrived in the chaos of battle. As the campaign stretched into 1797, Napoleon delivered a final blow to Austrian resistance at Rivoli, securing French dominance in Italy. By the time he marched on Vienna, the Austrians had no choice but to seek peace. The Treaty of Campo Formio, signed in October 1797, redrew the map of Europe. France gained new territories and resources, while Austria was left reeling from the humiliation of defeat. But it was not just the political map that had changed. Napoleon himself had been transformed. The young general who had entered Italy with an army on the brink of collapse now stood as a national hero, celebrated in Paris and feared by his enemies. His letters to Josephine, though filled with professions of love, hinted at a growing restlessness. Italy had been a proving ground, but Napoleon's ambition reached far beyond its borders. One evening, as he stood on a hill overlooking the plains of Lombardy, Napoleon allowed himself a rare moment of introspection. The stars above were scattered like diamonds across a velvet sky, their cold light indifferent to the turmoil of men. Below, the land he had conquered stretched out like a chessboard, its cities and rivers mere pieces in a game he had mastered. This was only the beginning. The Republic had given him command, and he had delivered victories beyond their wildest dreams. But Napoleon's vision extended beyond serving the Republic. He dreamed of reshaping the world, of carving his name into the annals of history, not as a servant, but as a master. Chapter 5: The Egyptian Expedition. The warm wind of the Mediterranean swept through the French fleet as it glided toward the shores of Alexandria, carrying with it the scent of salt and the faint promise of an ancient land. The ships, laden not only with soldiers but also with scientists, engineers, and artists, reflected the grandiosity of Napoleon Bonaparte's vision. This was no ordinary military campaign. It was an expedition to the cradle of civilization, a mission to carve a path of glory reminiscent of Alexander the Great. Napoleon, standing on the deck of the flagship Orient, gazed toward the horizon. His mind raced with thoughts of conquest and legacy. Egypt was not merely a military target, it was a gateway to the East and a symbolic conquest that could eclipse the achievements of antiquity. The young general's ambitions stretched far beyond the borders of Europe, and in Egypt, he saw a stage vast enough for his dreams. The landing in Alexandria was swift and decisive. French forces stormed the ancient city, overcoming its defenders with ruthless efficiency. As the tricolor rose above the sun-bleached walls, Napoleon addressed his troops in a speech designed to stir their hearts. "Soldiers," he declared, gesturing toward the ruins of ancient temples, "from the heights of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you." The campaign that followed was marked by a series of victories. At the Battle of the Pyramids, Napoleon's disciplined troops crushed the Mamluk cavalry, whose flamboyant charges were no match for the French square formations. The victory secured Cairo, and with it, control over much of the Nile Delta. Napoleon moved swiftly to consolidate his hold, dispatching emissaries to the local population and presenting himself as a liberator, a friend of Islam, and a scholar of their culture. But Egypt proved far more challenging than Napoleon had anticipated. The land, though rich in history, was unforgiving. The blistering heat sapped the strength of his men, and the ever-present desert sand found its way into every crevice of their equipment. The Nile, while a lifeline, brought disease, and the soldiers suffered from dysentery and plague. Meanwhile, local resistance simmered beneath the surface, occasionally erupting into violent skirmishes. Worse still was the news that arrived in August 1798. Admiral Horatio Nelson, commanding the British fleet, had caught the French Navy unprepared at Aboukir Bay. In the Battle of the Nile, Nelson's ships encircled and annihilated the French fleet, sinking or capturing nearly all of its vessels. The flagship Orient exploded in a spectacular fireball, lighting up the night and sealing France's fate on the sea. Napoleon's forces were stranded, cut off from reinforcements and supplies. The loss of the fleet was a devastating blow, and Napoleon's grand plans began to unravel. Yet, in the face of adversity, he refused to show weakness. To his officers and men, he exuded confidence, insisting that they could carve out a new future in Egypt, independent of the turmoil in Europe. While his army struggled, Napoleon immersed himself in Egypt's mysteries. The scholars and savants he had brought with him, the Commission of Sciences and Arts, set to work cataloging the land's treasures. They marveled at the pyramids, deciphered inscriptions, and uncovered artifacts that would ignite Egyptomania across Europe. Among their discoveries was the Rosetta Stone, a black granite slab whose inscriptions would later unlock the secrets of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. Despite these intellectual triumphs, the military situation worsened. Napoleon's attempts to extend his campaign into Syria were thwarted by logistical difficulties and fierce resistance at the Siege of Acre. The campaign stagnated, and morale among his troops began to falter. Illness and desertion took their toll, and the dream of an Eastern Empire seemed increasingly distant. By 1799, Napoleon's ambitions had shifted once more. Sensing the fragility of the French government and the growing opportunities for power in Paris, he made a bold decision. Leaving his army in Egypt under the command of General Jean-Baptiste Kleber, Napoleon slipped away with a handful of trusted officers. His departure, shrouded in secrecy, marked the end of his Egyptian adventure, but the beginning of a new chapter in his rise to power. As his ship cut through the waves toward France, Napoleon reflected on the lessons of Egypt. It had been a venture of audacity and brilliance, but also hubris and miscalculation. The desert had tested him as no battlefield ever had, tempering his ambition with the harsh realities of leadership and survival. Yet even in failure, he saw an opportunity to rewrite the narrative. History, after all, would remember not the isolation of Egypt, but the vision and daring that had brought him there. Chapter 6. The Coup of 18 Brumaire. The damp November air clung to Paris like a heavy curtain, muffling the sounds of a city teetering on the edge of chaos. The year was 1799, and France, weary from a decade of revolution, was caught in the throes of political dysfunction. The Directory, the governing body established after the Reign of Terror, had degenerated into a fractured, corrupt administration, unable to address the country's economic woes or protect its borders. Amid this turmoil, a restless populace looked for a savior. Napoleon Bonaparte, freshly returned from his ill-fated Egyptian expedition, found France ripe for his ambitions. Publicly, he downplayed the debacle in the East, his carefully crafted persona casting him as the conquering hero. Privately, his mind raced with plans for a new kind of victory, one won not on the battlefield, but in the corridors of power. The general's return to Paris was met with cautious enthusiasm. He carried the aura of military success, but many questioned his intentions. Over the following weeks, Napoleon carefully navigated the political landscape, courting influential figures from both the military and the legislature. Chief among his allies were his brother, Napoleon Bonaparte, the president of the Council of 500, and Emmanuel Joseph CS, a shrewd political operator who saw in Napoleon the means to achieve his own goals. Napoleon's plan hinged on swift and decisive action. The Directory was vulnerable, its power eroded by infighting and public distrust. CS proposed a coup to replace the Directory with a new government led by a triumvirate of consuls. Napoleon, however, saw an opportunity for something far greater. He would not merely assist in the coup, he would dominate it. On 18 Brumaire, year 8th of the revolutionary calendar, November 9, 1799, the plot unfolded. Under the pretense of a Jacobin conspiracy, Napoleon persuaded the Council of Ancients to move the legislature from Paris to the Palace of St. Cloud, ostensibly for their safety. This maneuver placed the lawmakers far from their base of support and under the shadow of Napoleon's loyal troops, who ringed the palace with bayonets gleaming in the autumn sun. The following day, the drama reached its climax. As the Council of 500 convened, Napoleon entered the chamber, flanked by soldiers. His entrance was met with uproar. Cries of "Down with the tyrant" erupted as delegates accused him of betraying the Republic. Napoleon, unaccustomed to such open hostility, faltered. For a moment, it seemed the coup might unravel. It was Napoleon Bonaparte who salvaged the situation. Rising above the chaos, he declared that the council was under duress, its members coerced by radicals. In a masterstroke of rhetoric, Napoleon called on the troops to intervene, painting his brother as a defender of the Republic against a conspiracy. The soldiers obeyed, dispersing the delegates with an efficiency that left no doubt about where power now resided. By evening, the coup was complete. The Directory was dissolved and a provisional government was declared. The new constitution of the year the 8th established the consulate with Napoleon as first consul, a position that granted him near absolute authority. Sieyès and Roger Ducos, the other two consuls, were little more than figureheads. The revolution, with its ideals of liberty and equality, had given way to a regime built on order and ambition. In the days that followed, Napoleon set about consolidating his power. His proclamations emphasized stability and reform, promising to end the years of uncertainty that had plagued France. The people, weary of chaos, largely embraced him. Yet beneath the polished veneer of public statements lay the unmistakable signs of authoritarian rule. Napoleon's skillful manipulation of the coup had revealed not only his political cunning, but also his unrelenting thirst for control. As he sat in the grandeur of the Tuileries Palace, now the seat of his government, Napoleon allowed himself a moment of reflection. The coup had been a gamble, but it had paid off in full. France, once a cauldron of revolutionary fervor, was now his to command. Yet even as he savored his triumph, his mind turned to the future. The consulate was merely a stepping stone. He had claimed power, but the title of first consul was not enough. Destiny, he believed, had far greater plans for him. Chapter 7. Emperor of the French. The gray stone spires of Notre Dame Cathedral reached skyward, their solemn majesty a fitting backdrop for a day destined to echo through history. Within its Gothic walls, adorned with tapestries and garlands, France's nobility and officials gathered in hushed anticipation. The scent of incense mingled with the faint chill of December air, while sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, casting shards of color across the marble floor. It was December 2nd, 1804, and Napoleon Bonaparte was to be crowned Emperor of the French. The revolution, with its cries of liberty and equality, seemed a distant memory. In its place stood an empire forged by one man's ambition, a realm in which the ideals of the revolution were reshaped under the iron will of its leader. Napoleon's journey to this moment had been marked by relentless determination. The consulate had solidified his grip on power, and a series of plebiscites had provided the veneer of public approval for his transformation from first consul to emperor. Yet Napoleon knew that the pageantry of the coronation would carry as much weight as any decree. This day was not merely about titles. It was a demonstration of his dominance over France and his defiance of the old European order. The ceremony began with the arrival of Pope Pius VII, whose presence lent an aura of divine legitimacy to the proceedings. Clad in white robes and bearing the symbols of his office, the Pope moved solemnly to the altar, his expression a mixture of reverence and resignation. Napoleon had insisted on the Pope's attendance, but he had also made it clear that no earthly power, not even the Church, would overshadow his authority. As the organ swelled, Napoleon entered the cathedral, his figure resplendent in a robe of crimson velvet trimmed with ermine. The golden laurel wreath upon his head evoked the glories of ancient Rome, a subtle nod to the legacy he sought to emulate. Behind him, Josephine followed, her gown of silver brocade glittering like the stars, her face serene despite the turmoil she must have felt. Their marriage had been strained by Napoleon's infidelities and the absence of an heir, yet today she stood as his partner, her presence completing the image of imperial grandeur. The climactic moment of the ceremony came when Napoleon approached the altar. The imperial crown, a heavy circlet of gold encrusted with jewels, rested on a cushion before him. Tradition dictated that the Pope would place it upon the ruler's head, symbolizing the Church's blessing. But Napoleon, true to his nature, seized the crown himself. With deliberate precision, he raised it high, the gesture a proclamation of his self-made ascent. Slowly, he lowered it onto his head, the act imbued with a defiance that left no doubt about where sovereignty lay. A ripple of awe passed through the assembly, though some, particularly among the clergy, recoiled at the audacity of the moment. Josephine knelt next, her eyes cast downward as Napoleon placed a smaller crown upon her brow. For a brief instant, the two were locked in a tableau of unity. Their roles as emperor and empress solidified in the eyes of the world. The ceremony continued with oaths and blessings, the ancient rituals transformed into a spectacle of modern power. As the final hymns echoed through the cathedral, Napoleon rose from his throne and turned to face the gathered audience. His gaze swept across the faces of his subjects, his officers, and his allies. They were witnesses to his triumph, yet he saw them as much more. Instruments of his will, pieces on the vast chessboard of Europe. Outside, the streets of Paris were alive with celebration. Crowds thronged the avenues, their cheers punctuated by the booming of cannons. The city glittered with light as night fell, a reflection of the hopes and fears inspired by the new emperor. For many, Napoleon represented stability and glory after years of chaos. For others, he was a dangerous usurper, a man whose ambitions threatened to plunge the continent into further bloodshed. Back in the quiet of the Tuileries Palace, Napoleon shed the ceremonial trappings and retired to his study. The echoes of the day lingered in his mind, not as a source of satisfaction, but as fuel for his unrelenting drive. The empire was his, but it was not enough. Beyond France lay the rest of Europe, and beyond Europe, the world. Josephine joined him briefly, her presence a soothing counterpoint to his restless energy. "Do you think they will accept you now as emperor?" she asked, her voice soft. Napoleon's lips curled into a faint smile. "They will have no choice. Today, I have shown them what is inevitable." The coronation of Napoleon as Emperor of the French marked the culmination of his meteoric rise. Yet, even as he savored his moment of supremacy, the seeds of resistance were already taking root. Across Europe, monarchs watched with alarm, and alliances began to form against the man who dared to crown himself. For Napoleon, the empire was not an end, but the beginning of a new phase in his quest for greatness. Chapter 8. The Road to Ruin. The summer of 1812 began with the rumble of boots and the clatter of wheels as the Grande Armée, over 600,000 strong, crossed the Niemen River into Russian territory. Napoleon Bonaparte rode at its head, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. The invasion of Russia, his most ambitious campaign yet, was meant to secure his dominance over Europe. Yet, as the vast army moved deeper into the endless expanse of Russian land, the seeds of disaster were already sown. The initial advance was swift. Napoleon's forces captured Smolensk and pressed onward, but the victories were hollow. The Russians, under orders from General Mikhail Kutuzov, retreated steadily, employing a scorched earth policy that left the French with little to sustain them. Fields were burned, wells poisoned, and towns abandoned. Each mile gained brought the Grande Armée closer to starvation and exhaustion. In September, the two armies finally clashed at Borodino. The battle, fought under a sun veiled by smoke, was a brutal and bloody affair. Cannon fire tore through ranks of soldiers, and the air was filled with the screams of the dying. By day's end, the French held the field, but the victory was Pyrrhic. Over 30,000 French soldiers lay dead or wounded, and the Russians, though battered, refused to yield. When Napoleon entered Moscow later that month, he found it deserted and burning. The Russians had set their own city ablaze rather than let it fall intact into French hands. For weeks, Napoleon waited for a Russian surrender that never came. The cold began to bite and supplies dwindled. By October, it was clear that the campaign had failed. Reluctantly, Napoleon ordered a retreat. The journey back was a nightmare. Winter descended with a ferocity that defied imagination. Temperatures plunged, snow blanketed the land, and the Grande Armée, already weakened, succumbed to hunger, frostbite, and relentless attacks by Russian partisans. Soldiers collapsed in the snow, their bodies frozen where they fell. By the time Napoleon crossed back into friendly territory, fewer than 50,000 men remained. The catastrophe in Russia marked the beginning of the end for Napoleon. His aura of invincibility shattered. The coalition powers, Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, saw their chance. In 1813, they defeated him at Leipzig, the Battle of Nations, and by 1814, Allied forces marched into Paris. Napoleon was forced to abdicate and was exiled to the small Mediterranean island of Elba. Though defeated, Napoleon's spirit remained unbroken. In March 1815, less than a year after his exile, he escaped Elba and returned to France. The news spread like wildfire, and within days, soldiers and citizens flocked to his side. The 100 Days had begun. Napoleon's return to power was brief but dramatic. With his old charisma and tactical brilliance, he reclaimed his position as emperor and marched to confront the coalition forces. His final gamble came at the Battle of Waterloo on June 18, 1815. There, in the rolling fields of Belgium, Napoleon faced the combined armies of the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian general Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher. The battle was fierce and closely contested. Napoleon's forces surged and faltered as rain turned the ground to mud, hampering maneuvers. Victory seemed within reach when Marshal Ney led a desperate cavalry charge, but the coalition lines held. Late in the day, the arrival of Blücher's reinforcements tipped the balance. Overwhelmed, the French army collapsed, and Napoleon's dreams of reclaiming his empire ended in a rout. Captured by his enemies, Napoleon was sent into exile once more, this time to the remote island of Saint Helena in the South Atlantic. Far from the grandeur of Paris and the battlefields of Europe, he spent his final years in relative isolation, his health deteriorating under the damp, windswept conditions. In his exile, Napoleon reflected on the trajectory of his life, his meteoric rise, his unparalleled conquests, and his ultimate fall. I wanted to found a European system, a European code of laws, a European judiciary, he lamented. There would have been but one people in Europe. Yet his ambition, unchecked and unrelenting, had led to overreach and ruin. On May 5, 1821, Napoleon died at the age of 51. His final words were said to be, "France, armée, tête d'armée," France, army, head of the army. He was buried on Saint Helena, though his remains would later be returned to France and interred in a grand tomb at Les Invalides in Paris, a testament to the enduring fascination with his life and legacy. Napoleon's fall was as dramatic as his rise. The Russian winter and the fields of Waterloo bore witness to the limits of human ambition, yet his vision and determination left an indelible mark on history. Even in defeat, he remained a figure larger than life, a man who had reached for greatness, and in doing so, reshaped the world.